Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're located. I wanted to welcome you to the Asia Society Policy Institute's first trade event of the year. And thanks again for joining us. Now, we're holding this event as the Biden administration is putting together their trade team, and they'll be reviewing and developing their trade policies in the coming weeks and months. And as the new team surveys the trade landscape, both domestically and around the world, they'll quickly see significant changes that have occurred over the past 4 years. And I would argue that no region has experienced such major changes on the trade front as the Indo-Pacific region. And I say this for two main reasons. First, economic ties between China and many Asian countries have strengthened over the past 4 years, particularly in the past few months, as the Chinese economy has recovered and has really served as an engine of growth and for trade with other Asian countries. And second, we have seen the conclusion and signature and implementation of two mega trade deals. The CPTPP now has been in effect over 2 years between 7 of the 11 CPTPP countries, and indications suggest that the United Kingdom shortly may indicate its formal interest in acceding to the agreement. RCEP, the Asian agreement among 15 countries, was signed last November, and expectations are that it will come into effect in the early part of 2022. Now, this has led some to call for a quick return by the United States to TPP. But as much as some would like to see this happen, including many in Asian capitals, I don't think the US return to TPP is in the cards, at least for now. And if we were to return, it's become clear that we would need to seek some important and consequential modifications, revisions, and updates. In our recent Asia Society Policy Institute paper, a TPP roadmap for the next administration, we explore these matters, and we recommend that as a first step, kind of as a building block, that the next administration, the Biden administration, should explore pursuing narrower sectoral deals in relevant sectors as a means to rebuild trust and gain momentum in the region, but also to participate in the rules making and standard setting. Pursuing narrower sectoral deals can be attractive options for several reasons. First, they're often easier and quicker to negotiate than a full-blown FTA. Depending on the topic, they can be less controversial domestically. Also, depending on the topic, they may not need congressional approval. And they can also serve as important potential building blocks for a future broader agreement. But they also present challenges as well, including identifying a topic and developing consensus around a topic to pursue. There are also often limited opportunities for trade-offs in important dynamic in concluding any trade deal. And they also raise questions regarding WTO compatibility. And to discuss these and other questions, we brought together today a great panel of 4 panelists with extensive expertise and experience. John Murphy is joining us from the Chamber of Commerce. He's the Senior Vice President for International Policy and has been prolific on matters regarding medical supply chains over the past year. Sarah Stewart is now the Executive Director of the Silverado Policy Accelerator, but she also was the former Deputy Assistant USTR for the Environment. Jake Colvin, Vice President of Global Trade at the National Foreign Trade Council. He's responsible for all things digital. And Yuka Fukunaga, who's professor of public and international law at Waseda University, is joining us from Japan. A quick housekeeping note then, I'm going to start with the panel with in a moderated discussion, and then we will welcome your questions that I will then pose to the group. So if I can ask you to use the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen and start typing in any questions that you may have for the panel, and hopefully we'll get to them at the last part of the panel. So with that long introduction, let's get right to the program. And I'd like to start with John Murphy with the first question. And that is, I've put forward some, at least my personal thoughts on some of the benefits, but also some of the concerns with respect to pursuing narrower regional sectoral trade deals. And I'd be interested in your views. Do you think that list is accurate? Are there other concerns? And how does the US business community view pursuing such deals? Over to you, John.
Well, thank you, Wendy. It's great to be here with you and the other participants today. I think from the perspective of the business community, there's a spectrum here from the multilateral to the plurilateral to the bilateral, and there's real trade-offs between all of that. So, the advantages of multilateral agreements, I think, are obvious. In the WTO, you have 164 countries that represent the vast bulk of the global economy. And if you can achieve rules there, they wind up being, essentially global rules that apply everywhere. They are the same rules everywhere. And there's advantages to that. There are transaction costs and so forth that are eliminated by it being exactly the same everywhere. At the other end of the spectrum, with bilateral agreements, you can go further, you can go deeper. So if you look at the typical US bilateral free trade agreement, they tend to eliminate tariffs on more than 99% of tariff lines, in some cases 100%, really gold standard market access. And in the rules chapters, you're talking about up to 30 different rules chapters. You can go deep. You can really set a standard that is sweeping. So there's a trade-off across that vast spectrum with plurilaterals somewhere in between. I think one of the dynamics here, though, is that one of the main things that trade agreements do is in setting rules, it's an opportunity to you want to go where the problems are to some degree. And with a bilateral agreement where you're getting those great rules, sometimes we wind up doing it with a like-minded partner where there really isn't that huge of a difference here. So think about the recent digital trade agreement between the United States and Japan. It's a great agreement. But one of the things that those kinds of agreements do is that the parties are committing not to discriminate against one another, not to abuse one another in different ways. And it's great to have that agreement, but it's not as if the United States and Japan were really doing it that much. Okay, so that's one thing that sort of limits the benefit. Now, at the other end, back at the WTO, there's a lot of parties where, we'd like to get those kind of disciplines in place. Now, between those extremes, you have plurilaterals where maybe you can get to a group that is, sort of like-minded and more trade-offs. With a larger group, you can have dynamic trade-offs where, and Wendy, of course, in the TPP negotiation, you can talk about how this played out. Making a deal with one party allows you to, in a dynamic fashion, there may be trade-offs that affect a third party within the negotiations, and it allows you to go further and deeper. So I think plurilaterals represent a compromise behind the two extremes that I was explaining there.
Well, thanks. Sarah, maybe I can turn to you. You were at USTR for a number of years. You saw firsthand how long kind of comprehensive FTA negotiations could take. And the negotiation was really just the first step in the process. You have to get these agreements approved by Congress, and then you need to go through the entry into force domestic procedures. So my question for you would be, do you see like the benefit of kind of being able to do narrower deals quicker important in a world where things are just changing so quickly every day?
A great question, Wendy. And I do. I think that there is a value in a lot of the areas that have been really pressing areas on trade recently, whether it's digital trade or environment or labor. With a new administration coming in, it's going to take time for them to develop what their trade policy agenda is going to be, to choose the partners that they want to negotiate with, to balance that with enforcement priorities that they have, and then to actually do the hard work of figuring out what the U.S. position is going to be for a comprehensive FTA, which has dozens of chapters. So, I think that the earliest that we would potentially see a comprehensive FTA coming down the pike is at least a year, if not more, away. In the meantime, I think that there's some real opportunities to do, some smaller deals on select areas that are of pressing concern, both to stakeholders, to Congress, and to the administration. I mean, the obvious downside of the sectoral deal, of a smaller package, is that it's not tied in with market access. And so there's a little bit of leverage that one could argue is lost by not having the ability to have trade sanctions backstop the commitments, of a sectoral. But I would also argue that, I think, especially in the case of the environment, the issues are too pressing to wait for that larger FTA. You've got to act, now and set the stage on issues like climate change and natural resource exploitation, trafficking, other issues, enforcement issues with countries that you see a path forward with later to set the stage.
Jake, where do you come out on this? Are you concerned that these deals may be too narrow as to have a real impact for the business community, or do you see benefits coming out of these agreements?
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks to you and Jenny for putting this together. I think on the one hand, there's a significant amount of enthusiasm among some in the business community, some of our members, around the kinds of sectoral agreements that we're talking about today. And I think it's particularly appealing to think about solidifying gains from USMCA across a wide region like the Asia Pacific. As we've learned lessons from COVID-19 for digital trade, for vaccine development and distribution, I think there's an opportunity to make meaningful improvements to the trade rules and push back on efforts to, for example, fragment the internet and to maybe create some more resilient supply chains. I also think there's enthusiasm for using these kinds of sectoral agreements as a sandbox to further develop rules and standards. I think, we'll get into the details later, but particularly interesting for things around the global digital economy. It's intriguing to think about bringing in new commitments on things like cybersecurity, on maximizing the ability of trade to be inclusive and benefit women and minority-owned businesses in the United States and around the world. So I think there's some real potential here. On the other hand, I know we and our members see some potential red flags as well. First, there's a huge amount of fatigue with these skinny executive agreements among the business community. And as you've seen, sort of outright opposition from Congress during the last administration to the Brazil deal in particular. I think, I want to be sure that we're on the same page with the Biden administration and Congress and make sure that, we're sort of identifying together whatever boulders we'd like to push uphill. Sarah mentioned as well the difficulties with enforcement in sectoral agreements. And, I'm sure there are creative current and former negotiators who might be able to think about some creative ways to enforce these kinds of agreements. So,
well, Yuka, maybe I can turn to you because I think one major concern that we hear from Geneva about these deals is that they raise questions concerning their compatibility with WTO requirements, particularly with regard to needing to conclude deals that cover substantially all trade. So can you share with us your views? Can that circle be squared?
Wendy, thank you very much for the great question, and thank you very much for having me in this great panel. Well, actually, Japan has already agreed kind of a sectoral trade deal with the United States, the Japan-U.S. trade agreement. And when Japan signed this Japan-U.S. trade agreement, the issue of the compatibility with the WTO came up in Japan. And there was a debate about whether this agreement met the requirement of substantially all trade liberalization requirement or not. And the explanation given by the Japanese government was, I have to say, not so clear. The Japanese government said that this agreement covers 90% of the trade between the two countries. But that number, 90%, includes the auto and auto parts trade. And the agreement on autos and auto parts have not been yet made, although there is an expectation that an agreement will be made in the future, but that agreement has not been made. So it was unclear whether the Japanese government was justified in including the expectation of liberalization or not. But in any way, and I think it's very important to make sure that FTAs comply with that requirement. But I think we have to be aware that this requirement of the substantially all trade liberalization was drafted in the 1940s. It's more than 70 years ago. So at that time, the reality surrounding regional integration was very different. And I think when we interpret that provision now, we have to take into account the historical evolution surrounding regional integration. And I think if we do that, if we interpret this requirement in light of the historical evolution, I think we can say that sectoral trade deals can be considered as interim agreements as defined in the WTO agreement.
John, if I can just ask just your views to follow up on that, do you think the WTO rules should be a constraint on pursuing these type of agreements? Or do you kind of agree with where Yuka is coming from? And that is, this is something we really need to look at. Maybe that provision has outlived its applicability to today's realities.
So I think that the business perspective is that there's good sense behind that WTO norm. But I suppose we come at it from a slightly different perspective, namely that, many deals have serious downsides because they undermine the case for an eventual broader agreement. So you take the U.S.-Japan agreement. The things that are in the U.S.-Japan agreement are really good things. They provide benefits for U.S. agriculture, for U.S. businesses of various kinds that rely on digital commerce. But part of the impetus for that mini deal was that particularly American farmers were at an increasing competitive disadvantage in the Japanese marketplace after CPTPP entered into force. And so their Canadian or Australian competitors were getting better access to the Japanese market. And what the mini deal did was largely address that concern. But in doing so, it took away the impetus which could have been harnessed to lead to a broader, high standard, comprehensive deal of the kind that the U.S. business community typically seeks. And, I represent a very broad business organization. Jake does a different organization, but I think is very much aligned on this, that, the typical model broad free trade agreement has so many advantages for so many different sectors. And, a lot of them got left behind in a mini deal. So I'm backing up that WTO rule, but I'm doing it from this more, I suppose, pragmatic business perspective.
Sarah, maybe I can ask you just a comment on this whole issue. Are these agreements really building blocks? Or as John suggested, is there the danger that the block stops once you do that smaller deal and the fatigue and the lack of interest in going further kind of sets in?
There's definitely merit to that for sure. And I think that there's, an argument that can be made that, the U.S. has often touted its trade policy in terms of FTAs as being state of the art because it's enforceable through trade sanctions across all chapters. So then if you look at a sectoral deal that doesn't have that, you can definitely make the argument that that's a backslide or, an FTA minus kind of a situation. I 100% acknowledge that, but I want to temper that for at least certain areas and my own experience being in the environment, because I think while true that we wouldn't want to send a signal that we would be backing off of a more enforceable set of commitments down the road, I don't think that we have time to waste or to spend in certain areas trying to get to that point. I mean, we spent how many years on TPP and we're still not in the deal. Meanwhile, if we had had some sectoral building blocks that we were working on, with some of the countries that were not FTA partners at that time, we would have environmental benefits that were flowing from that. We would have partners who are readying themselves for a comprehensive FTA. And, to that point, I think that's really important. Again, in some of these areas, not all. In my experience, there were countries that prior to having an FTA with the United States did not have environmental institutions, did not have oversight bodies, did not have any type of institutional infrastructure to actually engage in the type of enforcement that the US was expecting out of them. So all of that had to be put in place during the negotiation and, either pre-entry into force or immediately thereafter. And that was a struggle. So I think that these can be building blocks from that sense if they're done right, with an expectation that something more is going to come out of it. And I'll talk a little bit later when we get into the specifics about some ideas for potential other sources of leverage outside of trade sanctions that could be helpful in holding, ourselves and our partners' feet to the fire unless and until we get to a more comprehensive FTA that has that enforceability framework.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe when the CPTPP countries put the TPP 11 deal into effect, they didn't suspend provisions in the environment chapter. So a lot of the provisions that we were pushing for and putting on the table, they remain intact and they are being implemented by the 7 countries of the TPP so far. So maybe we can switch gears and I can start with Jake, because I think when we talk about regional sectoral trade deals, the issue of digital trade really comes to the forefront. And I think one of the reasons is that a lot of Indo-Pacific countries are on the forefront of digital, everything digital. Second, there's a lot of bilateral and other deals that are being made in the region. Earlier, Yuka and John mentioned the US-Japan digital deal, but Singapore has a deal with Australia. New Zealand has led this DEPA deal with a number of countries in the region. So I would just ask you on the digital front, can you just share with us for a few minutes, what are the prospects for a digital deal in the Indo-Pacific region? Who would be the potential participants? What would be the key provisions? And also, how would you address the argument that we may be hearing more and more in a Biden administration that this looks like a deal for business? Is it really a deal for workers? How would you address that as well? And you have 5 minutes to address all of that.
That's a lot to address in 5 minutes. I'll talk quickly. Well, look, I think there's a strong argument to be made for shoring up the policy foundations of the digital economy in the Asia Pacific. In spite of all the lessons that we've learned from COVID-19 about the importance of digital, we've seen policy responses and regulatory regimes that, I think ultimately threaten to fragment the global internet and undermine small business success around the digitally enabled global economy. You see things like digital services taxes, localization, differences among cloud standards that countries are following and other things like that. And so let me get to the points that you asked me to raise. What should be in an agreement? I think table stakes for any digital agreement would be gold standard commitments on digital trade and customs and trade facilitation. So, John and Yuko mentioned the Japan digital agreement. That was only digital. It was only about the digital trade chapter of USMCA. I think for a real robust digital economy agreement, you also need to add in gold standard customs and trade facilitation provisions to capture that entire sort of e-commerce ecosystem that small businesses in particular rely on to access global markets. Second, I think there's an opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, to kind of use this as a sandbox and deepen regulatory alignment on digital trade issues. And so, there are areas that a number of companies are interested in, like cybersecurity. Can you operationalize common principles like that were developed under the Paris call? There's a call to institute new commitments on establishing voluntary disclosure requirements for governments to call out cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Can you do more on privacy to align like-minded governments in the region? Cloud standards. And so, I think those issues would need to be more fully developed and would take a bit of time. I think the third area, and this gets to your question about, does this just benefit big businesses, is there's an opportunity to use this agreement or this kind of platform to maximize the benefits of the digital economy for small businesses and workers, and particularly make trade more inclusive for women and minority entrepreneurs. So, we could use an agreement to incorporate things like digital skills training and workforce development, building on commitments that we have in USMCA in the labor and environmental chapters for capacity building. One model is through our Global Innovation Forum, we've developed this startup global partnership with the U.S. Department of Commerce during the Pritzker administration, during Secretary Pritzker's time there. And you can use an agreement to sort of develop best practices and sort of digital skills development around educating small businesses throughout the region on how to engage digitally and globally. I think these things are particularly, sort of digital is particularly important to support women and minority-owned small businesses. Women and minority-owned businesses benefit from an export premium that's higher than for other types of businesses. And if you look at how Black-owned businesses small businesses performed during the COVID-19 crisis, Black-owned businesses relied on global markets for a much higher percentage of their revenue than white-owned businesses. And so can you use a digital trade agreement in order to maximize their participation in the economy among the countries involved? I think that would be an interesting thing for the Biden administration to pursue. I know I'm running out of time, Wendy, but you asked which countries might be natural partners. To John's point earlier, I mean, it's you could do this with Singapore, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and that I think would make it quicker. But you're really talking among friends there, and that's not where the problems lie. I think at the other end of the spectrum, you've got countries like India and Indonesia. Now, there's where some of the problems lie, and where a meaningful deal that aligns our countries on digital would be really important. But it's also really unlikely that we're going to get any kind of deal at all, let alone quickly, with those countries, by starting with those countries. So, there's a tension there. So I'll stop there.
Well, that's great. You put a lot on the table. We'll come back to some of that. Sarah, if I can maybe turn to you. You've already touched on some of the issues regarding climate and the environment. But if I can just ask you to share your thoughts, because we know climate is just a top priority issue for the Biden administration. They've already made it clear, like all agencies on deck, this is going to be a priority for all the different agencies, probably including the trade agencies. So what can be done in this area? And, trying to do a regional deal in this area, will this present some unique challenges?
It certainly will, but I also think that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. And just, as kind of to put this into context, I think, you hit on this earlier, Wendy. There's two major regional pacts right now, and the U.S. is noticeably absent from both of them. So, there needs to be a reassertion of U.S. Activity and engagement in the region. Environment is an area that has major benefits for both the United States and for trading partners in the region that flow from everything from helping with food scarcity to public health to disaster prevention to helping, even with, gender issues where, women and minorities often are the ones who are feeling inequitable or bearing an inequitable share of some of the challenges due to climate change and other environmental crises. So I think that's number one. Number two, as I mentioned earlier, waiting until we're into a comprehensive FTA posture, it's just too long. These are acute issues that we need to deal with now. Setting the bar on environmental standards in the region is really important. CPTPP does a great job of that, but the US has moved even further along with USMCA, and I'm imagining that the Biden administration is going to want to go even further than that. So that makes this really ripe, especially since RCEP doesn't include anything on environment. So there's a real vacuum there of leadership on some of these issues. I think in terms of, specific issues, looking at the Indo-Pacific region, you have of the top 10 global greenhouse gas emitters, the Indo-Pacific region, includes the US, India, Indonesia, Japan, and of course, China is one of the top emitters. Those top 10 global emitters account for 2/3 of global emissions. So working quickly and with partners in the region, I think is really, time is of the essence. The costs of not doing so are human life, animal life, public health. McKinsey did a report just recently that estimates that between now and 2050, higher temperatures in Asia due to climate change could result in a loss of economic activity in the trillions, between $2 and $7 trillion. So, there's a real economic piece to this as well. The Indo-Pacific region is also known for being a trafficker of wildlife and timber and fish. And this has ties to national security, transnational crime networks, as well as depletion of resources. So where do we go from here? The CPTPP does have an environment chapter. It is enforceable. There was one very important provision that was suspended after the US left, and that dealt with trafficking. And so, I think that's an area that we would want to resurrect and really hit on for the reasons that I mentioned. At the same time, as I said, USMCA has a bunch of new provisions since CPTPP that include air pollution or air quality control, environmental impact assessments, the first ever obligations on combating marine litter, the most comprehensive set of fisheries subsidies disciplines in any trade agreement. And that's just what the prior administration did. And so the Biden administration, no doubt, will want to add very specifically climate change to that, and hopefully will be able to do so because it is a different political environment. And so I think that if we were looking at a sectoral, we would want to look at the delta between the CPTPP and USMCA, and then we would want to look at what additional climate add-ons make sense. And just a few would be, adding the Paris Agreement to the list of multilateral environmental agreements that the countries would commit to effectively enforce and implement. I think we would want to have new commitments to collaborate on clean technologies, renewable energy, and energy efficiency standards. I think that there is a real opportunity as well to work with the CPTPP countries and potentially others on a list of environmental technologies that could, result in lower or zero tariffs in those technologies, which of course makes them, more accessible and cheaper to the people who really need them. Building infrastructure in those countries to deal with the flooding, drought, and high temperatures that are coming due to climate change. And I think a massive effort to combat deforestation. So those are just a few on the climate side that I think, could be part of a sectoral deal. As far as who, as you said, the CPTPP countries are already implementing a lot of environmental obligations, but climate is not included in CPTPP, not to any noticeable extent other than sort of indirectly. So I think that there's real room there for the US to be engaging with the CPTPP partners on climate change in particular. I also think that we absolutely need to be working with Vietnam on enforcement of its environmental laws. If we want to have Vietnam in, either in a bilateral or other regional, or we rejoin CPTPP, there's got to be more focus on enforcement. And finally, I would say India. I mean, the US has been trying to nail down a mini deal with India over the last, year or so without success. Climate change, as well as, a cooperation on cleaner technologies, is ripe for the taking, helps to deepen the relationship and, set that bilateral relationship on a new path.
Well, thanks for that. You've also put a lot on the table, a lot of food for thought here. John, if I can turn to you then on the whole issue of medical supply chains. I mean, this issue really came to the forefront during the early days of COVID, when a lot of countries, including the United States, found themselves kind of flat-footed with respect to access to PPE, certain other medical equipment, and for other countries, even medicines. And a number of middle-sized countries, as a result, kind of went forward with some initiatives, putting forward principles on how trade in this area should be open and export restrictions should be limited and temporary. And so, and it also led to calls for reshoring, not only in the US, but in Europe, as well as in Japan. So my question for you, is there potential for some kind of regional deal in this sector, which could, where we would be prepared for the next pandemic, but we would also work with others, recognizing that we can't make all of this stuff at home and be self-reliant?
Well, thanks, Wendy. I do think that there's a case for some kind of engagement internationally to have some kind of trade agreement relating to medical supplies. But I think it's interesting to see the distinctions between the different areas we've been talking about. There's a very different rationale in each case. My earlier comments, I wound up explaining the logic behind the U.S. preference for big comprehensive FTAs. But I agree with Sarah, and who's pointed out that they take such a long time and they're just not practical in addressing some of these problems. The environmental initiatives that she's described, you're addressing a global commons problem. And that's not the same thing as what we've typically done in our FTAs. Or, in Jake's comments about digital trade, we're at this moment where, 60% of services can be traded digitally. And because of the pandemic, it's become more important than ever. So there's also a logic. And the logic behind a medical supplies agreement of some kind, it's also very compelling because we've seen these terrible shortages. I think it's useful to stop and ask, where did the shortages come from? The ITC in December put out a very useful report looking at supply chains for medical goods, and it's very illuminating. For instance, when it comes to N95s, those very important masks that healthcare workers use, somewhat to everybody's surprise, they found that, 80% of these masks for the US market are made here in the United States. So contrary to the popular myth, it's not so much a trade problem. It's not that production was offshored. It's that demand surged by 40%. So I think you have to understand the problem before you come up with a trade solution. On the other hand, there's endemic ongoing shortages of medical gloves. And Malaysia is still producing about 60% of world supply. So you have to understand the different dynamics with different products. There has been interest internationally in some kind of a sectoral agreement for trade and medical supplies. The Ottawa Group, which brings together the Europeans, Canadians, and several other you might call them pro-system WTO members, and they've been talking about tariff elimination amongst themselves. I think another topic that comes up in this area, though, is export restraints. In the first months of the pandemic, we saw export restrictions proliferate in a number of countries around the world, and that actually made pandemic response more difficult. Even in Europe and among European Union member states, there were these export restrictions where trucks were seized at the border within the EU. But the good news is that faded as people realized how counterproductive that was. But it might be useful to have a reiteration of the WTO norm here. The WTO members have committed not to impose export restrictions with very limited exceptions. So an agreement that addressed that eliminated tariffs that continue to be high on a number of these goods, it would have some virtue. But my final comment would just be for us here in the United States, one of the ongoing challenges in this area it's not global tariffs, it's not MFN tariffs, it's Section 301 tariffs on imports from China, which continue to be high on a number of important medical goods. I just heard in the past couple of weeks, the United States continues to levy steep 301 tariffs on swabs used in testing. And there's, of course, U.S. production, but it's inadequate. And I do think sooner than any trade agreement, given the urgent focus of the Biden administration, quite appropriately on the pandemic, addressing some of those 301 tariffs would be a really good idea.
Great. Thanks for that. Yuka, if I can turn to you then, we'd be interested in if you could share with us, where would Japan be with respect to some of the issues that have been put on the table? Because in many respects, if the US and Japan could work together and work within the region, it would bring a lot of weight to pursuing some of these agreements. And any other comments you might have on where other CPTPP countries might fall with respect to digital, medical, or climate would also be welcome.
Thank you very much for the question. And well, there are so many issues that I have to address, and I'll try to bring the Japanese perspective on some of these issues. And I start with digital trade. Well, digital trade negotiations are one of the most important priorities for the Japanese government. Perhaps you remember that a few years ago, then Prime Minister Abe announced the concept of the data-free flow with trust, DFFT, at the Davos conference that attracted much attention. And at the Osaka summit, he declared the launch of the Osaka track. And Japan is also one of the co-conveners of the WTO negotiations. And when you speak about the trade negotiations or trade agreement, what came up to my mind was an agreement. There is a chapter in the TPP on e-commerce, but that chapter is not modern enough compared to one in the USMCA. So perhaps we can modernize that TPP's chapter up to the grade of the USMCA. But as Jake mentioned, problems are not with developed countries. Problems are not with Japan, Singapore, or Australia. Problems lie with other developing countries. And in order to address those problems, perhaps we should address these problems in a broader context, and at least, especially for Japan, since Japan is one of the co-conveners of the WTO negotiations on e-commerce, the best case scenario for the Japanese government, Japan, is to have a global, wider role on this matter. And climate change, Sarah mentioned the two comprehensive trade deals, the CPTPP and RCEP, and Sarah mentioned that the U.S. is not a party of none of them, but Japan is fortunately a member of the both agreements. But unfortunately, as Sarah mentioned correctly, the CPTPP has a chapter on the environment, but that chapter is relatively modest compared to the chapter on the environment in the USMCA. And Sarah mentioned that the RCEP does not have any mention on the environment, but actually the negotiating objectives of the RCEP did not include the environment. But if you take a look at the preamble, there is something about the sustainable development. So I can feel an interest, I can sense the interest among the RCEP members, the ASEAN countries, to engage in environmental trade and environment negotiations. So the goal for Japan will be to update the CPTPP environment chapter, and also include some provisions on the environment in the RCEP context. So that will be this climate change will be a very promising topic for the region, for some CPTPP partners and in some ASEAN countries as well. And lastly, medical supplies. Well, as John mentioned, there are some limited exceptions to export restrictions on essential goods, and as John mentioned, many countries introduced export restrictions in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and obviously Japan is so dependent on imports of certain medical goods, so. Those export restrictions are a great concern for Japan. But I'm not sure if we can realistically introduce additional rules to limit the right to impose export restrictions. This is the sovereign right for countries to restrict exports to secure the supply of medical goods for their people. So I don't think I have to say I think it's really difficult to introduce additional requirements. However, perhaps we can have transparency requirements to make sure that export restrictions are not overly restrictive, and the information about those restrictions will be notified to the WTO or to in the context of RT, regional trade agreements, and so on. So that's my response to your interventions.
Well, that's great. I think you shared with us a number of interesting thoughts. We have a number of questions from the audience. I'm kind of going to group them into the first would be getting back to the issue I asked Jake in the beginning, specifically on the digital trade agreement, and that is, look, the Biden trade policy, we're going to see more and more about looking at trade deals or trade initiatives through the lens of what benefits U.S. workers and what benefits the U.S. middle class. There was one question on that. Can the other two speakers address that with respect to climate and medical? But the other question is, how about the whole issue of slave labor and other kind of worker rights that are included in ILO conventions? Should these somehow be part of these deals? And another question, which also got at the point that one of the problems with these narrow deals is then you lose your ability to include a labor chapter or include, important kind of worker-oriented provisions. So I'm going to put this all on the table. I think something that I think Washington, we're going to be talking about this more and more, but I would just turn to our speakers and see if they have any comments. I won't call on anyone unless no one wants to say anything. Then I'm going to call on someone. Sarah,
I'm
John.
to jump in on the labor point, because I think that there's a lot of analogs between what I've been talking about on the environment side and the labor chapters. Certainly not exact same thing, and I don't want to speak for for the labor movement. But again, if we're looking at a sectoral deal as a way to deepen a relationship, to help to set a blueprint in the area, to be a glide path for something, down the road, I can't see the harm in, immediately starting to work with countries on some of these issues, whether it's worker protections or environmental protections or whatnot, even outside of an enforceable framework, because that doesn't preclude you from getting to that enforceable framework later. Especially when many other chapters and other issues get put on the table, and those become then attractive to the other countries to translate what the sectoral deals on labor and environment into something that's backstopped by trade sanctions.
John, any comment from you, being from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of discussions within your building about the implications of the kind of this new orientation in our trade policy, how that's going to affect kind of corporate America. There is a perception among many in America that our trade agenda thus far has really been propelled by corporate interest. And there seems to be kind of a movement now that's going, well, let's just say there's going to be a shift in that policy where trade agreements would be scrutinized and looked at with respect to how these deals benefit workers and the U.S. middle class.
So thanks for that really easy question, Wendy.
Yeah, exactly.
I do think that it's a bit of a false distinction to say that there are trade policies that are good for workers and others that are good for the companies that employ them, because they're really in the boat together. And just to illustrate, I saw in the Wall Street Journal a quote from Larry Summers where he was saying, and I'm going to pile on Larry Summers, who's not in government right now. He was saying, we shouldn't be prioritizing Hollywood and intellectual property and their interests internationally. And I would just push back on say, that's a great example of somebody not to throw under the bus. It's a huge sector, hundreds of thousands of workers. They're actually mostly unionized. The wages are, close to $100,000 on average, and they're scattered all over the U.S. So, before you start saying, don't look out for that corporate interest, let's dig a little bit deeper under this. But I do have one other comment on that general theme, though, which is, look, there's always a tension between the push for harnessing trade as an engine of growth, or in our current circumstances, economic recovery on the one hand, and on the other, conditionality in trade. And these debates are going on a lot in the United States right now. GSP has expired, partly because they're looking at adding new conditionality to it. People are holding up USMCA as a model for its new labor provisions, for instance. And I think that we have to be circumspect about how much can be done in these areas. I would argue that in the case of USMCA, Mexico is a country that is almost uniquely dependent on the U.S. market. And Mexico was going to be motivated to engage with the United States and make commitments that other countries simply would not, because they're not as dependent on the United States. I'm skeptical that, the average ASEAN market, for instance, would be making those same kinds of commitments. So I think being circumspect about where we are in the world, how much influence we have. GSP is another example of that. GSP imports are about $25 billion a year out of a couple of $1 trillion that we have. Are countries really going to completely rewrite their approach to the issues on which we're imposing conditionality, which may relate to a whole host of issues? Maybe to some degree, but you can. There is such a thing as potential overreach on these areas, and we have to find a balance going forward.
Yeah, I think you raised some good points with respect to the extent of U.S. leverage. One other just theme of a couple of questions, and then this will be our last issue, and this is more from an international developing country perspective, and that's the issue of trade-offs. I think some of us addressed in the beginning of this conversation. And one of the questions from the viewers is, in these sectoral deals, if you're not offering market access to the US market, do you really have the leverage, or can you capture the interest of particularly developing countries to sign on to some of these deals? And so I would just ask our panelists, if market access can't be included in one of these agreements because they're narrower, are there other things that could be included in these agreements, like capacity building or technical assistance, which could also provide, benefits and kind of spark the interest of particularly developing countries to in such agreements? Jake, we haven't spoken to you for a while. Any comments here?
Yeah, I think on a digital agreement, market access from the United States isn't an issue because we're already pretty good on that. I think the attractiveness here, both for developing countries, but also for the United States, is that there's a direct correlation amid COVID in particular with digital skills and business resilience. And so, you see research that says that digital drivers, these small businesses who use digital tools more intensively, did much better than those businesses that didn't. A survey of Canadian small businesses last year said that more than half of the businesses that had an existing online presence saw sales either increase or stay the same. And so I think, as you look at the attractiveness of a digital agreement, and this gets back to Matt's question as well, is, what can you put in there that is attractive for workers and for businesses, small businesses? Look at digital skills training and workforce development. And so, I mentioned that we had the Startup Global partnership with the U.S. Commerce Department, and it's all about making sure that small business owners and workers have the digital skills they need and understand the private and public sector digital resources available to them in order to succeed. And so, could you use an agreement like this to develop programs across the countries that are involved to expand access to capital, to new digital platforms, and to public-private sector partnerships? Could you do that specifically for women and minority-owned businesses and really start to sort of connect a network of small businesses and government officials? This is something that the US and UK have been doing on a small scale as the result of an agreement between them to host US-UK small business dialogues over the past several years. I think there's an opportunity there.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that, we're going to conclude the program, but I think you raise a good issue that we need to think about this differently, that the old days it was tariffs for rules. And in this new paradigm of trade, we need to think out of the box and really think through these agreements, what they mean, what benefits they could deliver, and where they could be kind of beefed up to address some of the valid concerns with respect to the middle class and workers. So with that, I'm going to conclude today's program. An excellent discussion. John, Sarah, Jake, and Yuka, I think you did a great job. I think we only scratched the surface. I think this is kind of the beginning of a conversation, but we got really important issues out on the table. And I look forward to continuing this conversation through future webinars and roundtables, because I think this is the types of discussions we need to have as our trade agenda is going to evolve for sure in the coming weeks and months. So thanks again to our viewers and to our panelists. For those in the United States, have a great rest of the day. And for those in Asia and Europe, have a great evening. Bye. Thank you.